Hello, everybody, and welcome to another in our series of conversations between Caleb Maupin and Maupin Brar. And today we're going to be talking about imperialism and war, and specifically why it is that those two things are inextricably linked, why it is that while we have imperialism, we also will have war. So I'm going to ask first Harpal, if you could, to give us an overview, as briefly as you can, what is imperialism? Because a lot of people use the word, but they use it interchangeably with the word empire, just really to refer to kind of foreign policy. But as Marxists, it has a more specific meaning for us.
Well, imperialism, in the words of Lenin, who really is the groundbreaker on the subject of imperialism, imperialism can be just summed up in these words: it's monopoly capitalism. There has been concentration of production to such a level that every industry is controlled by 3, 4, or 5 large individuals and mainly corporations, and they control vast amounts of production facilities. Along with that, there is the growth of banks, which at one time, about 200 years ago, were humble middlemen taking deposits from one set of customers and loaning money to another set of customers and taking a little bit of commission. But in the process, they have grown huge. They become giants of finance, and they control not only the financial part of it, but very often control industries through ownership of shares, interlocking share ownership, interlocking directorships. Along with that, you've got the development of monopolies on an international scale through mergers and acquisitions, like the electrical industry or the oil industry, where all sorts of different countries contribute to the concentration of production on an international scale. You only have to look at the oil corporations, like Exxon and the French oil companies, etc. And they're huge. And finally, there is the partitioning of the world. If I can at this stage give you a quotation from Lenin, which says, "It's beyond doubt that capitalism's transition to the stage of monopoly capitalism to finance capital is connected with the intensification of the struggle for partitioning of the world." What it means is that by the time imperialism, finance capital, or monopoly capitalism comes on the scene, the world has already been divided. For example, hello? Hello.
Continue.
For example, at the end of the third quarter of the 19th century, 90% of Africa was unoccupied. Not unoccupied in the sense that there were no African people living there. Of course, they were living there, but it was unoccupied by any of the big or the great powers, as they were called. But 30 years later, all of Africa had been partitioned. Different countries had taken up different territories. Britain and France, being the most powerful countries, had taken most of it. Little Belgium was given the whole of Congo, several times the size of Belgium itself. So Germany was given a few colonies in Western Southern Africa, but most of the stuff was grabbed by Britain and France. So Germany, by the time of the turn of the century, say the first decade of the 20th century, has become very powerful. Its rate of development had been phenomenal, and as a result, it had spurted far ahead of its competitors, principally Britain and France at that time. And Germany felt cheated that although she was more powerful than her rivals, she had much smaller share of the colonial loot, of the slaves, of source of raw materials, of avenues for investment, of the availability of market, it had far less share, and it demanded its fair share. And under bourgeois justice, she was perfectly entitled to say that the old division was based on the old balance of powers. That has now changed. And the division of the colonies, the division of the avenues for investment, etc., needed to be brought into consonance with the new balance of forces. Now, if Britain and France had agreed to do it peacefully, there would have been no First World War. Or if Germany had said, it's all right, we are late arrivals, we won't ask for more, we are happy with whatever we have got. But that's not the way things are settled in the world of finance capital. So Germany had basically arrived too late at the banqueting table when all the seats were taken up, and Germany therefore could only get a seat if somebody else would vacate it. And they would not do it voluntarily, so they had to be kicked off their seats. And that's really what led to the First World War. That is the main reason. It's a war for repartitioning. And since under imperialism, because of the law of uneven development, the balance of forces, the balance of productive capacity would continue to change, would undergo change. And these changes have got to be recorded in what each country has by way of its share in looting the world. And therefore it necessitates partitioning, repartitioning again and again on a recurrent scale, unless such time as imperialism is put an end to. That's why the solution to the problem lies in getting rid of imperialism. As long as there is imperialism, there would be war. Of course, there was war before imperialism, but the imperialist wars are on a completely different scale and for completely different reasons. Of course, as long as there is private property in the means of production, distribution, and exchange, the source of war is there in germ. But under imperialism, it gets exacerbated, and it becomes not war on a local level, but war on a global level. If Germany and France and Britain were fighting in the First World War, that war spread to many corners of the world. It wasn't confined to Germany, Britain, and France.
Thank you, Harpal. And what really comes out of that for me is, or what I really sort of want to underline from that, I guess, is that imperialism is an economic system. It's not a foreign policy. It's not a decision that this or that government can or can't take in order to be more or less nice or nasty, right? And that's something I think that a lot of critics of imperialism still can't really get their head around, Caleb.
Sure, yeah, that imperialism is not a policy, but rather imperialism is a system. It's a mode of production. It's capitalism in its monopoly stage, defined by these characteristics of finance capital, territorial partition, the rule of the world by trusts, cartels, and syndicates, an international financial oligarchy. All of this is laid out very brilliantly by Lenin, and that a lot of people just can't get over this notion that imperialism is something you do. I always say imperialism is not a verb, it is a noun, right? It's a system. It is not a policy. It's not an action.
Absolutely. So where does that leave us when it comes to understanding our enemy and trying to fight it? Harpal said, the only way to end war is to get rid of imperialism. But what does that mean for the working class in the imperialist countries? Harpal?
Well, first of all, the working class has to understand. And before the working class, the communists have to understand, because the communists in the centers of imperialism leave a lot to be desired. That imperialism, finance capital, seeks domination. It does not seek freedom. It seeks domination internally, where few corporations control production in different areas, and it seeks domination on a world scale. And war, as Lenin pointed out, taking Clausewitz's dictum as his guide, is a continuation of policy by other, i.e., more violent means. War is not something that drops from heaven and for no reason whatsoever. One day the British or the French or the Germans got up and said, I haven't had a war for 20 years. Wouldn't that be a good idea? No, they had a war because it was a continuation of the policy that these powers had been pursuing. And the policy on each side was to achieve domination. And domination can only be at the cost of each other. So they formed, obviously, alliances with different powers. Britain and Germany and Tsarist Russia were on one side. On the other hand, you had Germany with Austria-Hungary. So they were pursuing a policy of domination. And that was exactly the policy they were pursuing during the war. And their aims were exactly the same as they had been in peaceful times, i.e., to achieve domination. And once the war ended, the same policy would be pursued by these powers at peace negotiations, with the only difference that the defeated powers would obviously be undone, and the results of the war would be registered in the treaties they sign at the end of the war, as, for example, the Versailles Treaty after the First World War, when Germany, defeated in the First World War, was treated extremely harshly, so harshly that it laid the foundations for the rise of fascism in Germany and prepared the ground for the Second World War. So,
Caleb.
Sure. I mean, the imperialists have been carving up the world among themselves. That led to the horrendous conflicts that we've seen in the 20th century. Can't disagree with anything that was said.
We're all in full agreement. We could just go home. I think we have to talk, don't we, about the fact that the term imperialism has now become contested territory. So Lenin, having done this fantastic job for us of defining exactly what is imperialism, what does it mean, how it's the monopoly phase of capitalism, that the original capitalist countries had gone global in their attempts to escape their crises by getting bigger and bigger markets and conducting production on a bigger and bigger scale, and they're sucking the wealth towards themselves and they're dominating the globe, they're divided up amongst themselves. He described the phenomenon so brilliantly, and during the history of during the progress of the First World War, he showed how imperialism was actually not only monopoly capitalism, but capitalism in decay, in its final decaying, moribund, decadent, he called it all these things, stage, and that capitalism or imperialism was also the era in which all of the contradictions were sharpening in the system to the point of preparing the ground for socialist revolution. And of course, the Bolsheviks were able to act on this and have their socialist revolution during the First World War. Other communist parties were not as clear-sighted, didn't understand the opportunities and the necessary strategy and tactics in order to make use of the crisis to turn it into revolution. But the Soviet Union nevertheless came out of World War I, and the beginning of the era of socialism came out of World War I. And I think that relationship is something that many people don't understand, but the bourgeoisie internationally have understood it to the extent that they realize that socialism and their own crisis is threatening the stability of their rule and their system, and they definitely target our movement. And one of the ways they do it is that they take our terminology from us and subvert it. And we now have a whole literature where imperialism has become a term, like a swear word, that bourgeois academics and politicians use against any country that stands up to them, particularly if it's a big country. And a whole load of literature now exists to say that Russia, China, even India, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, that any country whose economy is growing, that has a certain size, is necessarily an imperialist country, and all kinds of justifications are used to push this idea. So, Harpal, do you want to talk a bit about this, where it comes from and what it signifies?
Well, I think one of the things to understand is that one of the chief characteristics of imperialism is export of capital, as opposed to export of commodities. Commodities were traded before imperialism as well. But what happens with the arrival of imperialism is that capital has become so abundant in the imperialist countries, as it were, Lenin says, it overflows the national boundaries. It cannot usefully and profitably be employed at home. It's got to be employed abroad. So imperialists export capital and set up production facilities abroad. And they do that because in these countries to which capital is exported, labor is cheap, labor rights don't always exist, trade unions are not very, very strong, land is cheap, and every other facility is made available to the imperialist corporations, and they produce there and, of course, make a lot of money. That's the whole point of being in business. That's the whole point of being involved in this system of production. So it's export of capital, and because they export capital, they're able to make and repatriate a large amount of profits that they make from the exploitation, not only of their own workers in their countries of origin, but also in the countries to which capital is exported. It has certain effects on the working class movement that we'll come to, and that is, out of these huge profits they make, a certain portion can be and is set aside for bribing the upper layers of the working class in the imperialist countries to buy social peace. And these people become really opportunist, because opportunism, of course, in the terminology of Leninism, is betraying the long-term interests of the working class for the sake of certain temporary or imaginary benefits that they will gain. And that's why a certain section of the working class at a crucial moment actually goes over to the side of the bourgeoisie. This is precisely what happened during the First World War, when, apart from the Bolsheviks and probably one or two other smaller parties, the parties of the working class went over to the bourgeoisie and defended the imperialist war of their own bourgeoisie in the name of defending the fatherland, when in fact they should have been fighting against their own bourgeoisie, overthrowing it and bringing socialism. The world would be a completely different place if that had taken place. And even today, in the imperialist countries, these bribed sections of the working class are the ones that control, for lack of a better word, the so-called left parties, like Labour Party in Britain or the Democratic Party in America. They control it. These are the people in whose interest and in the interest of imperialism the whole system is run. They defend imperialist looting, because without imperialist looting, they will not get the fringe benefits that they get from the being allowed a few crumbs of the imperialist table. For them to defend one is the only means of defending the other, one being imperialism and the other being their own narrow interest. And that is precisely what happens.
You've done painted a really good picture there, Harpal, of something that's so important for people to understand about imperialism. Since it's an economic system, but it's an economic system which consists mainly in a machinery of industrially looting the world. And, so the labor and the resources, all the wealth of the continents outside of the imperialist countries is the labor that produces wealth and the natural resources. All the profit from all of that work, and whether it's whatever it might be, is sucked back. People work, just to stay alive at a very bare subsistence level, and everything they produce gets sucked into the centers of imperialism. And the more that the imperialists do that, the more they're able to do that, because the weight of their capital has this kind of a gravity, attractional force to be able to keep investing and reinvesting itself to make more money. And this is a very sophisticated, very strong machinery of looting. And as you also emphasized, it has created an impact in the imperialist countries themselves on the working class, because our rulers have been able to give us little bribes, and to some of us quite big bribes, some privileges that are reliant on the continuation of this system, and which create a loyalty in the leadership of the working class movement itself. And it's the secret of our inability to organize ourselves for revolution, is the fact that our leaders are so consistently bought off in hundreds of little ways. And we see it, in Britain, and I'll come to Caleb in a minute to hear more about America, but, in Britain, we have seen consistently for the last 100 years, our movements, whether they are for better pay and conditions or towards, or for peace or whatever it might, against austerity, constantly betrayed and misled. And, from the 1926 general strike through to the 1984-85 miners' strike, to the strike movement we're seeing right now, consistently what we've seen is that the trade unions ally themselves to the Labour Party, which allies itself to the ruling class of the country. And in each of these big fights, the union leaderships, hand in hand with the Labour Party, sell out the struggle of the workers to defend their pay and conditions and make social gains in order to keep the system of exploitation going. So we have this relationship between the system of imperialism, the fact that our rulers are imperialist rulers, and our own inability to organize effectively in our class interests. Caleb.
Well, this whole question of the aristocracy of labor, the section of the working class that gets some crumbs from imperialism and is bought off, and thus, its loyalty becomes to the imperialists rather than to the global working class. It's very relevant in everything that's going on in the United States right now, globally, and it's what's interesting is Lenin was writing about this, and he describes the methods through which these bribes are delivered. Right, he talks about jobs on the staff of quote unquote respectable newspapers. He talks about seats in parliament and government commissions. And what's interesting is you can see that this kind of mechanism for making one section of the working class more loyal to the imperialists has really, it's evolved and adapted over time. After the Second World War in the United States, you had the post-World War II economic expansion, and living standards in the United States were rising very rapidly. And that's the period where the white industrial working class was really flourishing, right? You had auto workers, steel workers, meat packers, others who, were working in industrial jobs, but they got, a house and a car, and that's the American dream, the white picket fence. And that was, to some degree or other, a way of buying their loyalty to empire. And they supported, the United States. They supported the crushing of the Communist Party and McCarthyism, et cetera. But now, in the period we're living in, we're seeing all of that being broken down, right? The living standards, the industrial middle class of the United States is long forgotten. Just forget about it. Detroit is completely, all the houses are foreclosed. It's completely shut down. But what we're seeing now is that they have a similar method, I would argue, of trying to maintain control and trying to, buy the loyalty of some who would be otherwise revolutionary minded. And it's not available, I would say, to the bulk of the broad masses of sections of the working class like it once was. But it's rather, it's among sections of the population that might be dissident or whatever. And it comes in the forms of the NGO apparatus. There's a huge apparatus that has been created of foundations that seem like they're concerned about racism, or they're concerned about workers' rights, or they're concerned about this or that, where young people that might have leftist or revolutionary ideas can get hired and they can get a full-time job. And it's all funded by the ultra rich of the ruling class, by the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the Ford Foundation. But in order to work at one of these places, you can't be a revolutionary. And that a lot of younger people are kind of hired into working for this NGO apparatus as a way of buying making them pro-imperialist. And, I mean, for example, in the United States, there's a supposedly Marxist organization called the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And their whole strategy is to get their members hired at these NGOs, at these pro-worker or these anti-racist or progressive foundations, and get them, getting salaries, paid by these foundations. And somehow they're going to maneuver within it, right? They're going to, operate and use Mao's methods to maneuver within it. But what it really leads to is they join these foundations, and then that leads to them having to change their politics in order to fit in, and more they shed their revolutionary understanding, and they become loyal foot soldiers of the Democratic Party. And that this NGO apparatus, when Lenin talks about the respectable jobs at newspapers or seats in parliament, he's describing a similar process where people that staff what should be working class or revolutionary organizations, they get something handed to them by the imperialists. They get a decent job, or they get some opportunities or whatever, and that leads one way or another to buying their loyalty to the system.
It's a brilliant exposition you're giving us, Caleb, of something that I have called the NGOization of the left. This turning of revolutionaries into bureaucrats and functionaries of the system that they're supposed to be opposing, right? And they become oppositionists within the system rather than real opponents of the system. And it's as you said, the tentacles of this machinery are huge. And I feel like, it's something we recognized some time ago in the oppressed countries, how NGOs would go to Africa, or Latin America, and they go to communities that are really, impoverished and suffering greatly from the effects that imperialism, leaves in their countries. And they would come along and they would find the kind of natural leaders in a community and give them jobs. And then they would become, instead of the leaders of their own country's revolutionary movement against the oppression that leaves them, so poor and underdeveloped, they would become the official professional dolers out of imperialist charity to the right ones amongst their population. And it is actually a similar situation of what you're describing, what happens in our trade unions, in all kinds of supposedly anti-capitalist or anti-racist or whatever organizations. These are all ways that the imperialists have devised to keep the mass of the population divided and to decapitate the kind of leadership that should be rising up to direct the struggle and the anger of the oppressed peoples, and also to keep, as you say, a section, or as Lenin pointed out again and again and again, a section which is bribed into loyalty to the system and becomes its functionaries within the working classes movement. Harpal, I don't know if you want to say something more on that.
Well, I just really like to say is that it's not at all strange that even in the communist movement in the imperialist countries, the thesis of Lenin as to the effect of imperialism on the working class movement is not accepted. It's ignored respectfully or contemptuously dismissed, because most of these movements are based on the privileged sections of the working class, whose interests and they defend, and they get sucked into that position, into that system. They don't want to lose their members, because the moment you start saying this is the effect imperialism has, you are basically giving them the uncomfortable truth, and they might leave you. So in order to keep them, or to keep your subscriptions or money they donate flowing to you, you keep quiet. And basically what you're doing is you're collaborating with the selling out of the movement to imperialism, all in the name of making your organization stronger, larger, and being blessed with resources for continuing its work. As regards what the NGOs do in third world countries, I just want to give you one example. In India, one of the horrible aspects of Indian life is the caste system. It's been there for millennia, and it is there that where people are from birth assigned a certain caste. You are either from a higher class or you are from a lower class. Now, of course, these people struggle against that injustice, which is quite right and proper. What the NGOs do is go and find the natural leaders of these communities, and they make them obsessed with fighting just the caste system. Instead of saying that the caste system could only be eliminated by doing away with the feudal survivals in Indian society and by marching forward towards a democratic revolution, instead of bringing solidarity among people from castes. And there are poor people among higher castes as well. Not every Brahmin is rich. Not every Brahmin is an Andani or Ambani or Tata. No, they're not. Instead of bringing unity, they just make people fight against each other on the basis of caste. Capitalism, to a certain extent, does away with these caste distinctions, because when you're working in a factory next to a person who is from a different caste, it doesn't really matter. Even if you have a thinking which is backward, your struggles together bring you together. It's exactly the same in the United States. It's no point constantly trying to divide blacks and whites. More important it is to bring them together to overthrow the system that has been responsible for slavery, and after that, the discrimination that is practiced, even despite the victory in the Civil War of the progressive side. The discrimination against Black people continued, and it doesn't begin to be reduced until the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So it's very important not to get obsessed with these distinctions, but the purpose of the struggle should be, while fighting against that kind of discrimination, to bring people together, to bring working people together. Now, war is a continuation of policy. The policy that is pursued by the parties waging war is the party they will be pursuing during the war to achieve those aims, because they've been unable to achieve these aims by so-called peaceful methods. So they're trying to use not peaceful methods in order to achieve their purposes. And at the end of the war, it will be clear which side has won, and this will be registered in a peace treaty of some kind. Imperialists, of course, do not wage war by saying, we are imperialists and we want our proper share, or we want to keep the share that we've got. I'm the old, rich imperialists, what Lenin called the fatter imperialists, who have been gorging at the imperialist table for much longer than others, do not want to give up. They say, by law, it's ours. Yes, by bourgeois law, it's ours. But the new ones challenge. And they say, in the name of justice, we want our share. And it can only be settled by war. But imperialists wage these wars in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom, in the name of rule of law, and any number of other excuses. And that is quite right and proper. I just like to give you a very small quotation from Plekhanov. He says, Marx said very truly that the greater the development of antagonism between the growing force of production and the extant social order, the more does the ideology of the ruling class become permeated with hypocrisy. In addition, the more effectively life unveils the mendacious character of this ideology, the more does the language used by the dominant class become more sublime and virtuous.
That leads me perfectly on. If you would let me, Harpal, intervene there, because it leads perfectly to something I wanted to bring up, which is the way that the imperialists today, in their assault on Russia, they are claiming to be opposing evil Russian imperialism. Putin has an evil empire, they say. He's oppressing all the peoples who are living inside the territory of Russia. We must decolonize Russia. That's one of the claims they make. Now, of course, you know, Plekhanov pointed it out, Marx, Lenin, they've all at various times pointed out, of course, you know, it's the bourgeoisie's job to try to confuse us while it carries out its nefarious aims. What is shocking and criminal to my mind is to see how many parties supposedly of the Leninist tradition are actually repeating this propaganda about Russia and about China and many other countries, and using exactly the same type of phrases and terminology as the imperialists are using to describe those countries which are getting in their way. Gopal.
Absolutely, Jyoti. I mean, this brings me. I had half an hour free, so I got some 2 or 3 choices quotations from brilliant people, and this is a little quotation from Engels. He says, "A bourgeoisie turns everything into a commodity, hence also the writing of history. It is part of its being, of its condition of existence, to falsify all goods. It falsified the writing of history. And the best paid historiography is that which is best falsified for the purposes of the bourgeoisie."
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
can I just finish? So what we get these days is that everything is falsified, as Jyoti said, because they're not opposed to the word imperialism as long as it's applied to their opponents. Russia has to be de-imperialized, which is really a code word for saying Russia has to be broken up into small, digestible pieces so that the imperialists can go and lord it over the country, and they can loot it and subject it to rampant looting and exploitation. That's the meaning of it. So you have to decode the words that imperialists and their ideologues, the intellectuals and historians and social scientists use. They got armies of people. You and I struggle to get 1 or 2 people who will help us, but imperialists have armies of people. The imperialist profits allow them to be able to hire these people, and they are mindless people. Some of them deliberately, they know they're telling lies, but it's good money. As Engels says, the best paid historiography is the one which is best falsified for the purpose of bourgeoisie. So I give you 2 a tip if you haven't already got it. You want to make money? Falsify history. Start making statements in favor of NATO and US imperialism or British imperialism, and overnight you'll be on every main channel. And what's more, your appearance wouldn't be free. A check will come before you have reached home from the studio, and your books will be advertised. You will be shown to be one of the greatest intellectuals who's come up with some fantastic stuff, which is stale old stuff in the service of imperialism.
Caleb.
Well, what's interesting is that, you know, things have changed a lot over the course of my short life. I mean, I'm only 35 years old, but I remember there was a time where it was only leftists. We were the ones saying, well, the USA was a society founded on slavery, founded on the genocide of the native peoples. And, you know, this is a society rooted in imperialism. This is an imperialist country. And then with that analysis, we would say things like the U.S. invasion of Iraq was completely wrong and unjustified. Iraqis had the right to resist the U.S. occupation. What we've seen in the last couple of years, and I think this is particularly interesting, is that there seems to be now a very widespread, especially among the liberals, acknowledgement of the big picture. They'll say, yes, the USA was founded on slavery. Yes, the USA was founded on the slaughter of the indigenous people. But then they take that big picture narrative and they find a way to redirect that to be absolutely wrong on every issue that is currently facing us, whether it's Russia, whether it's, you know, China, you know, they kind of turn it around. And it's very bizarre to watch. Meanwhile, they then equate any defense of Russia and China with, you know, the new right. We have the rise of the new right in Europe and the United States with the Trump and the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again. In Britain, you've got Brexit, and in France, you got Le Pen, and that that seems to be what the main forces of imperialism are more afraid of right now, is this kind of, this right-wing insurgency by some levels of the capitalist class. I mean, it's not a working class movement by any means. This is a section of the capitalist class of their own countries that, for whatever reason, wants to operate in a way that is not in the overall interest of the imperialist system. And they've kind of utilized people of left-wing persuasion to be their foot soldiers in fighting the new right. And they've then equated genuine anti-imperialism with the new right. If you question what the mainstream media says, well, you're spreading conspiracy theories, and that's just like what Trump says. If you are defending Russia, well, you must be a right winger because Russia is a right wing country, and it is Trump who likes Russia, so therefore you must be. And they've created this kind of bizarre equivalency where in the name of kind of this, and the other thing that they've done, I will add, is that they have kind of taken this understanding of imperialism and this understanding that that sections of the working class in the United States have been bought off or whatever. And rather than looking into the actual mechanics of how things work in our time, they've blatantly racialized it. They've said, well, white people benefit from imperialism, so therefore anyone who is fighting for the interests of white workers is therefore pro-imperialist, right? And they've made this a blatantly racial thing where it's like, what we need to do in the United States as leftists is just come together and talk about how white people have had it too good, and why they need to acknowledge that, which, I mean, it's not that there isn't any truth in that, right? I mean, it has been the white working class historically that have been, the biggest supporters of wars, etc. But they want to have a racial conversation rather than a conversation about what the imperialists are doing right now, what countries they're targeting, and who is opposing it, et cetera. And it's this weird kind of turnaround where, especially since the pandemic, with the woke, I don't know what you want to call it, the woke turnaround of imperialism, all of a sudden, we're supposed to support Joe Biden in attacking Russia, and we're supposed to support Joe Biden in cracking down on Donald Trump. And if you oppose it, then you're a racist and a white supremacist. I mean, this is the way they've kind of turned around the rhetoric, and it's very confusing. And a lot of leftists, just because they have this gut level opposition to things like racism, things like, chauvinism of any kind, they fall for it. But what they don't see is that they're becoming useful soldiers of imperialism in fighting Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran and all the countries that are breaking out of imperialism. And just because imperialism is now using progressive phrases, and just because there's this lower section of the work of the capitalist class that for whatever reason is opposing it with its own demagogy, that doesn't change the nature of what's going on. We still have the imperialist system trying to beat back countries that have broken free from it.
Thanks, Caleb. Before I pass to Harpala, a couple of observations from what you were saying. You were talking about how, it seems like there's been a shift in what the imperialists in their narrative are prepared to recognize. I mean, this is something we've seen happening with imperialism on the back foot, actually ever since 1917. But in particular, I think as the recent crisis has become deeper, it's actually a sign that imperialism is on the back foot. There's increasing numbers of people who are no longer satisfied, right? Because their conditions are worsening. The Keynesian consensus from World War II has come to an end, and the lower section of the working class is sinking back to the levels, towards the levels it used to be in before World War II, before it got the hefty bribe that came to everybody and not just to the labor aristocracy. And in that condition, there's a lot of anger, a lot of unrest, a lot of turmoil, and a lot of recognition that this system is wrong and it doesn't work, right? And I think what we're looking at is new means to divide and rule, as the peaceful means of just bribing everybody is not available to the imperialists, right? Their economic crisis means they're no longer able to bribe the whole population. They're going back to bribing just a section of the population. And then how do you keep everybody down in that situation? You have to come up with all these culture wars, the way you put people black against white, and people who love trans people versus people who hate them. And it's this, you take all nuance out of every conversation and you polarize people around all kinds of issues. And it seems to me they tried to do that with the issue of race. They take it out of all of its context, of the real context, which is it's a tool of the imperialist system, right? And that imperialism is the thing that has to be attacked if you want to attack racism. And they turn it into black people versus white people. Harpal.
No, absolutely. What is happening is, I think there are two things that we really need to stress in the working class movement. One is the effect of opportunism in the working class movement. Precisely for that reason, no matter how difficult it is, in the words of Lenin, we must go deeper and lower among the working class and get hold of people who are excluded from this gravy train. People who don't get the benefits that the bottom sections of the working class get. It's important for us to mobilize those people. They're more difficult to organize, but it's worthwhile organizing them, because socialism, once they understand, means much more to them. It resonates with their everyday existence and with their life. That's one thing that we need to do. Secondly, what we need to do is that war is a continuation of policy. The substance of imperialist policy is domination. It's not freedom. While they speak of the freedom of their people and they treat their people with total contempt, as we have pointed out several times on this channel as well, that while there were 2 million people demonstrating against the then impending Iraq war, British planes were flying over the heads of these demonstrators, going on bombing missions against Iraq, which had done nothing against Britain or the United States. And we've got to somehow explain to people, what is the point of 2 million of you coming out if nobody listens to you? You got to find a way whereby you would be listened to. And the only way to do it is to organize, to get organized, not just in trade unions, which have limited politics. I'm not saying people shouldn't be in trade unions, they should, and carry our policy there as well. But it's important in each country to build strong communist parties with discipline who can actually, over a period of time, teach the working class what imperialism is about. Thirdly, what imperialism does not let you know is the distinction between just and unjust wars. We communists are not opposed to war as such. We're only opposed to unjust wars. We're opposed to imperialist wars. We're opposed to the wars which are for domination, which are for extending the exploitation of the exploiting classes. But there are wars we support. For example, the wars for national liberation of the oppressed people against imperialism. And it's the Bolsheviks who, for the first time, have brought the national question and the understanding of the national question in a way it wasn't present. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, before the Russian Revolution, when people talked of the national question, they talked of a few civilized countries like Ireland, Serbia, Poland, etc. The hundreds upon hundreds of millions of people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America who were oppressed by imperialist powers were not part of their vision at all. People were treated as civilized and uncivilized, black versus white, educated versus uneducated, of which only the civilized ones were supposed to be the carriers of superior civilization, and they had the right to rule over other people. And the October Revolution put an end to that nonsense and broke down that wall between the so-called civilized and the uncivilized, between people in the colonies and people in the imperialist countries. And that is a great contribution. That's precisely why the countries fighting for national liberation naturally gravitated towards the Soviet Union, not just the working class of the imperialist countries, but also the oppressed people, because it was only in Moscow that they got the support that they needed in their struggle against imperialism. So we support the wars for national liberation. We support wars against absolutism. There are many places where, medieval monarchies rule. Middle East is a perfectly good example. A people fighting even for a bourgeois revolution or fighting against these medieval monarchies, we support those wars. And of course, we must say, if wars of socialism against imperialist countries, if socialist countries are engaged in a war against imperialist countries, we support the socialist countries. As, for example, the proletarians and oppressed peoples of the world supported Bolshevik Russia during the Civil War and War of Intervention, or later on during the heroic fight of the Soviet people during the great patriotic war of the Soviet people against Nazi Germany. We support them. And finally, of course, the most important, we support the war of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. You cannot be a socialist and be opposed to war, because that would mean you wouldn't support the war of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. So there are these wars we support, but what we do not support are imperialist wars, and we must be able to distinguish. And that distinction between just and unjust war is sought to being obliterated in the present conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which is not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It's a proxy war waged by the neo-Nazi NATO alliance against Russia. And we must support Russia instead of saying Russia is also an imperialist country, that this is an inter-imperialist conflict and we wash our hands of both. There are some parties that do it, and we oppose that. And we must expose these parties that are confusing the working class and comparing this war to the First World War. If we were social chauvinists, would we not be fighting on behalf of our own bourgeoisie and saying, let's get rid of Russia because Russia is an imperialist country? On the contrary, we are the only upholders of the rights of the British working people, as you would be in the United States of America, because we are against our own bourgeoisie, waging an imperialist war in order to subdue, in order to cut into pieces the great Russian mass and make it easy to digest and exploit. So that these are the messages we must take to the working class movement.
Yes, I mean, Russia is not an imperialist country. China is not an imperialist country. If you look at the definition of imperialism, these are both countries that were under the domination of the imperialists and broke free. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was being looted and devastated. And then Putin came into office and he restructured the economy of Russia to be centered around the export of oil and gas. And, you know, they rebooted their economy and rebuilt their industrial base on the basis of exporting and, you know, subsidizing industry with the proceeds of Gazprom and Rosneft to state-run energy corporations. That is not an imperialist economic setup by any means. And if you look at the relationship Russia has with countries in Africa that trade with it, if you look at the relationship Russia has with Cuba, with Venezuela, with countries like that, this is not an imperialist relationship. This is not territorial partition of the world. There's not extraction of wealth and super profits being made. That's just not the reality. And the same can be said for China. If you look at what China's doing with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the One Belt, One Road initiative, this isn't imperialism. Are there corporations in China and in Russia that trade with countries around the world? Of course. And are there profits made in that trade? Absolutely. But the relationship is not an imperialist relationship in the sense these countries are not having their development held back. These countries are not being kept poor by the Russians and by the Chinese. And if you look at the relationship the United States or Britain or France has with the countries that it trades with versus the relations that Russia and China have with the countries they trade with, it doesn't match. And, you know, I mean, and they point to little examples of, you know, here, well, this Chinese corporation mistreated somebody, or here, this Russian person did this. It's like, you're not making the case. One person doing some bad thing or one instance where some pressure was put on somebody, that doesn't that doesn't denote an imperialist relationship. Imperialism is a relationship. It is a system. Russia and China are very clearly not imperialist in any sense of the word. They just are in the Leninist sense of the word, at least, right? They're not imperialists. And people who want to call them imperialists, I've noticed that many times the people who make these claims that Russia and China are imperialist, they don't even really feel a need to justify it. They're not pulling from Lenin and all of that. They're pandering to the bias that people have from consuming mainstream U.S. media, and they're just trying to gain some kind of credibility. They think that I can criticize the United States, but as long as I denounce Russia and I just say, oh, but Russia's bad too, or Russia's evil, then people will listen to me. No, they won't. Right? It doesn't work that way. Right? You don't gain any credibility by trying to echo the imperialists. You don't get more respect. So I would urge people to just stick with the Leninist definition of imperialism and just objectively look at the economies of Russia or China. They're not imperialist by any sense of they're just not, right? Even if their interventions militarily were not justified, they would still not be imperialists. Even if there are policies that they've engaged in that are problematic, they're still not imperialist. Imperialism is a system. Russia and China are not part of that system. They've broken out of that system, and that's why they're being targeted.
Absolutely. Thank you, Caleb. That was beautifully put. You've reminded me of something I wanted to bring up, which is this distortion of statistics you pointed to, and this cherry picking of, find a tiny fact here and use it to support a big argument. If you read Lenin, what's wonderful about him is he backs up everything with deep, and just like Marx did, deep, broad, wide study, bringing together, so looking at something in its entirety, all the forces that act on it, bringing together deep data that make the case, in a whole way. What these people do is pick one statistic and try to pretend it means something in a grand scale, which it doesn't. They've taken it out of context. I'll give you one brilliant example. In a recent article I read, which was trying to say that, Russia and China are imperialist, it tried to show by size of economy that, look, China is now number 2 economy in the world. What a joke. China has 1.4 billion people. All you have to do to realize what a trick's being played on you is to go to a list of countries where the GDP or whatever is put next to per head of the population. And then you see what trick is being played on you, right? You can debunk that pretty quickly if you stop and think, but of course, not many people do. And you can baffle people with statistics as well as informing people with statistics. And this is a good trick the imperialists like to play. But if you really look at where are the main stores, the big historically accumulated huge sums of finance capital located, they're still in the same places identified by Lenin 100 years ago. And there's a reason for that. Because capital, what's the job of a capitalist? To take a lump of capital, invest it, make a return, and so, next year it's bigger than it was, right? And then you have a bigger amount to invest at a profit and bring back, and then you have a bigger amount, and then you have a bigger. So every time you do that, you're sucking wealth towards yourself. Now you think about historically that process to create those stores of capital, they're so distorting in the world's economy. You can't just come along now and displace these huge stores of wealth, by wishing, right? The only way those powers are going to be displaced is by what happened to Tsarist Russia, which is that they are going to be appropriated. That wealth will have to be appropriated in a revolutionary process and redistributed. If it's allowed to continue its worth of extracting wealth from the labor of the people of the world, it's going to continue to grow in the places where it is. It's a historically established fact now, and I think people are just really oblivious to this kind of reality, and when we look at the words that they use to turn us against their own enemies, the imperialists branding Russia and China as imperialists, they are harnessing our instinctive feeling that imperialism is bad to neutralize us, to put us on the sidelines and stop us from taking the side of Russia and China and all the countries who are targeted by the imperialists and recognizing we're on the same side. They want to stop us from making common cause because, of course, that is ultimately the way in which our side is going to win and the imperialism is going to finally be defeated. Harpal.
I'd like to come back to a point which was made earlier, I think by Caleb, and that is there are a lot of things which are correct, which are said by the right wing. For example, the alternative for Germany in the case of Germany, and there are things which are said by Trump and some of the people in regard to America, although they're a mixed bag. Now, we must not actually be frightened of associating with something correct that is being said by any of them, just because they're right wingers, just because they serve the exploiting classes. If there is a contradiction within the ruling class, if there are people who are pointing out what is wrong with the present war in Ukraine, for example, JFK Jr. is doing in the United States of America. I listened to his wonderful interview with Tucker Carlson the other day. If there are people in Germany who do not support the war in Ukraine, they are actually people who are motivated by a desire to see Germany great, because what they're saying is the present war that is being waged by NATO is not only a war against Russia, it's also aimed at Germany to destroy this big industrial powerhouse of Europe and to prevent it from having a rapprochement and closer relations with Russia. The American bourgeoisie had always opposed the construction of the Nord Stream. They were unable to prevent Nord Stream 1. And now, finding no other way, they have destroyed it physically. It's not done by some peripheral, small, 6 Polish soldiers coming on a dinghy and doing it. No, it's a professional job done by the American Army and the American Navy. They've destroyed it so that when the war ends, even if the Germans want to have close energy relationship with Russia and the Russians are willing to have that relationship, it'll take years before this pipe can be restored. So the only country that gained from that destruction was the United States in imperialism. So when they make, or they do not want to support the war in Ukraine, are we going to start supporting the war in Ukraine just because some right-wingers are saying we shouldn't be supporting this war? I think we should use every opportunity and every contradiction that presents itself to us to be able to advance the cause of the working class, i.e. fight against imperialism. I'm afraid when I look around, I find myself increasingly agreeing with the right wing, not because I'm a right-winger, not because I'm a fascist. It is because the only people, and they're not fascist, they're right-wing. Right. You must make a distinction between right-wing and fascist. They're not fascist. For the moment, there's no need for fascism, either in present-day Germany or in the United States or in Britain, because the fascism only comes when the working class is threatening the citadels of capital and is about to storm it, or in the aftermath of a failed revolution. Now, with the working class movement being so weak in America, in Germany, in Britain, there's no need for fascism. But these right-wingers believe their country is being ripped apart. Why should their country be sacrificed? Why should its industry be destroyed for the benefit of the United States of America? And if they're doing that, we should actually be happy with that. You know, if they're raising the banner of independence for their country, we should be supporting that independence instead of being frightened that people will say, so you're supporting bourgeois nationalism. We're not supporting bourgeois nationalism. We're supporting the struggle of, for example, some German people against the attempt to destroy their industry. And this can be used for a purpose, and we should not be frightened of associating with it. There is not really a single policy that is being put forward by the so-called left that I agree with. I don't agree with the woke culture. I don't agree with dividing people on the basis of color, on the basis of sex, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sexual proclivity, etc. I do not agree with them. And these scoundrels are always able to support any imperialist war in the name of democracy. They want to get rid of Saddam Hussein because he's a dictator. They want to get rid of Putin because he's a dictator. The real dictators are actually located in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin. They're the dictators we should fight, who present themselves in very, very deceptive and democratic colors. I mean, for example, they'll tell you they're fighting against Afghanistan. Why? Because Afghanistan was responsible for 9/11. Now, there is very little evidence to support that 9/11 was the work of the Afghan authorities. Majority of the people who were involved in 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. And they came from not poor families, they came from very well-off families. They were people motivated by seeing their country being constantly looted by imperialism and their ruling class being humiliatingly subservient to imperialism. Now, whether you agree with me or not, the basic thing is that imperialism finds any excuse, or they'll say, Afghans don't allow women to be educated. Well, I'm in favor of females being educated to the same level as males. But that's not something that imperialism gives a damn about. Women were being educated under the progressive regime in Afghanistan. And what did imperialism do? It armed the Mujahideen to bomb schools, clinics, hospitals, and schools where girls were present. They were all destroyed, all in the name of fighting against Russian imperialism. So we have got to make sure that we don't fall for deceptive slogans, but we use imperialist. We must use evidence. There's evidence everywhere. The life itself reveals the hypocrisy of imperialism's assertions that they have nothing to do with democracy and freedom. They're prepared to tell lies anywhere. American Secretary of State Colin Powell will go and carry some small bottle saying, this is, ladies and gentlemen, what Saddam Hussein has got. It's got some vicious gas which could destroy half the population of Europe within 45 minutes. And they know very well it's not true, that Saddam Hussein was buying uranium from Niger, which he wasn't. So, I mean, all the facts are there everywhere. And you have bourgeois journalists who are paid huge salaries, basically not to write articles and do research, but regurgitate the communiques issued by the defense and foreign ministries of their respective imperialist countries.
Thank you, Harpal. Caleb, we're probably going to have to bring to an end today's conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with before we go?
No, I think it's a great way to conclude. So thank you very much. And yeah, until next time.
Thank you, guys.